Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Ms. Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair, founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council.
Good morning. And I was going to cut my remarks very short because we're running a little late, but I think if we all talk fast, we'll do just as well. And I wanted to welcome everybody to this inaugural U.S. Caribbean Ports and Maritime Forum. For me, I'm thrilled to be back in Miami and Miami Beach, a city and a state that I've called home for so many years. It is, in a way, the inspiration behind the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and, of course, the Caribbean Initiative. I founded the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center in 2013 with the mission of bringing Latin America and the Caribbean to the center of global affairs and as a key player to solving the most pressing issues of our time. This Caribbean initiative, through the forum, is seeking to do just that. As ports play an essential role in regional trade, in regional investing, energy security, public safety, deepening the U.S.-Caribbean cooperation on maritime security is key to strengthening the port systems and foster development and economic growth of the entire Western Hemisphere. Today's forum launches a long-term platform focused on strengthening U.S.-Caribbean cooperation across ports, shipping, and the broader maritime sector. This would not have been possible without the support of our partners, including Port Miami, Acero Capital, FGS Global, and a special thank you to our founding partner, Tropical Shipping. I'd also like to thank our long-term partners in DC and Miami, Florida International University. Guess what? They're having their conference right next door. But for FIU, for this partnership, and I want to welcome Brian Fonseca, who is the director of the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, to share some remarks. Brian?
All right, good morning. Look, Adrienne's the boss, so when she says everybody's got to move fast, I'm going to take that as a directive, and Adrienne, I'm going to move fast. But I did want to just properly welcome everyone to this inaugural event. I focus a lot on the security side. In the security business, we say tactics win battles, logistics win wars. And maritime security is such a vital part of the broader global logistics space. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this. FIU, as Adrienne was saying, has an incredibly deep relationship with the Atlantic Council, and of course, the incredible program that Jason leads at the Adrienne Arsht Center for Latin America, or Latin America Center. He has been such a vital partner in so much of what we do at the university, and it's not just my institute, or the institute's not mine, but the institute I have the privilege of leading, but also the Adam Smith Center, the Latin American and Caribbean Center, whose director is here, Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz, and of course the Green School of International and Public Affairs. Our organizations comprise sort of the thrust of the university that works very closely with Jason, the Atlantic Council, to ensure that we're informing thought leadership on a wide range of issues related to the region. And so we're very fortunate to be in that place. A lot of the work that we do, again, focuses broadly on the security domain, not just maritime security, but the broader geopolitical landscape, of course, the very difficult work of combating and competing against illicit trafficking organizations that have proliferated across the region. This is much of what we have the opportunity to do, and to do, of course, in concert with the Atlantic Council. And so we're really privileged to do that. Some of the work that we've had the opportunity to do, and I'll just flag this and highlight because I have one of my colleagues, Dali Santana, who's outside, showcasing some of the work we're doing on illegal fishing, for example. A few years ago, the Department of War approached us and asked us to help develop a dashboard that would take all of this massive amount of AIS data and visually display vessels that were likely engaged in illegal fishing across the hemisphere. as big issues to the region, not just from an economic perspective, a security perspective, an ecological perspective. And so what we did was work closely with Windward AI to develop a publicly available dashboard infused with artificial intelligence that not just flags vessels that are engaged in fishing activities, but then highlights vessels that are most likely engaged in illegal fishing because we have the signature. We know what vessels engaged in illegal fishing look like. They turn off their AIS data. They do ship-to-ship transfers. They loiter outside of EEZs. We can predict that using massive amounts of AIS data over time. And so what we've done is we've kept that in the public domain. And I can tell you confidently now that there are security institutions across the hemisphere that use that dashboard as a means of helping increase their ability to not just board vessels, but board the right vessels, because it's not about proximity, it's about precision. In fact, one deployment of our capability where US analysts were using it in cooperation with Peru, that dashboard that we're going to show you outside helped increase the hit ratio from 10% to 90%. That means 10% of the vessels that were originally being boarded were being boarded because they were in line of sight. Once we put that open source dashboard out in the public domain, Coast Guards and Navies were able to increase their ability to say it's not just a random ship, this is a ship that's been flagged as a vessel that's likely engaged in illegal fishing. And so we've done a lot of work in supporting decision-making and thought leadership, of course, within Department of War, and we do that in concert with the Atlantic Council. I guess the last pitch I'll make, and then I'll get off stage quickly, is we have our upcoming Hemispheric Security Conference, which is going to take place on May 5th through the 7th, again, in partnership with the Atlantic Council. We'll have the opportunity for a broader dialogue on a wide range of security issues. It is, I'm biased in saying this, but it is the premier convening around hemispheric security in the world. And so we'd be privileged to have extend invitations to all of you. It is out and available for the public. That's part of making this accessible so that we can all rally around a set of shared security issues. So mark your calendars, May 5th through 7th. Atlantic Council and FIU will be bringing together the largest convening. This will be our 11th year and probably the most impactful. That's the challenge. Every year it's got to be more impactful than the year before. And so we're excited to do that again this year. And so with that, I now have the privilege of inviting two of your opening speakers to the stage. First, I'd like to invite our moderator, Patricia Francis, to join us on stage. And she's going to have an enlightening and thoughtful discussion with the Honorable Matthew Samunda, who's the Minister of Water, Environment, and Climate Change in Jamaica. And so, Minister, if you'll join us on stage as well. Thank you.
Good morning. That was a very enlightening presentation from FIU, and Minister whispered to me as you were speaking that he's not sure that our Fisheries Department actually has access to your information, and that's something that we'd like to connect with before we leave here. But this morning, I'm very happy to welcome Minister Matthew Samunda to the podium to set the stage for this event. Minister, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And congratulations on your recent appointment as chair of the United Nations Environment Assembly. I know that's going to give you a lot more work than you anticipated, but it helps you to bring a unique combination of global environmental leadership and practical responsibility for climate resilience and sustainable infrastructure at home. We meet at a moment when maritime systems are being reshaped simultaneously by climate pressure, evolving trade dynamics, and decarbonization of shipping and tourism. The Caribbean is the world's largest cruise destination, and we were able to have a look at that yesterday, how impressive it was. And certainly Miami stands as the global capital for cruise operations. And for our region, ports are more than infrastructure. They are lifelines for economic stability, food security, and regional connectivity. So perhaps let's start there, Minister, with strategy. There's a growing shift globally from treating climate resilience purely as a risk mitigation towards viewing it as a source of competitive advantage. From your perspective, how can Caribbean ports, and Jamaica in particular, leverage climate resilience to strengthen their position within global shipping and cruise networks?
So I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that climate change is certainly a third of what we classify as a triple planetary crisis, which affects all things sustainability related. For Jamaica, like other Caribbean nations, we are small island nations but large ocean states. And every aspect of the triple planetary crisis, every aspect of climate change is affecting negatively our oceans. So for us, climate resilience is not a subject for competitive advantages. It's building climate resilience for first survival and so that we're not uncompetitive. Because the reality that we face, and just to set the context, over the last 5 years in Jamaica, Jamaica has had a Category 4 hurricane, a Category 5 hurricane, and landfall of 2 tropical storms. We've had our hottest day on record. We've had 3 out of our 4 worst droughts in 120 years. And we've also experienced 3 of our top 10 wettest days in 120 years of collecting the data. So for us, the discussion as to whether or not the climate has changed, whether or not the weather patterns have shifted, whether or not there is impact from these changed weather patterns is not one that we engage in much. But we are very minded that because the climate has changed for factors outside of our control, that building in resilience is critical for our achievement of our economic ambitions, for the stability of our society. And you're right, Pat, shipping and ports are at the core of our economic development strategy. So it's a large part of our future. Jamaica, going back to its colonial days, it was a logistics hub for the Spanish in the 1600s. Port Royal was the logistics hub of the then British Empire at a particular point. And for Jamaica's own development, it must be a logistics hub and a gateway into Latin America if it is to develop. So understanding climate risk, and that is using what is well established and well accepted as systemic risk assessment tools. Jamaica has its own. Using systemic risk assessment tools to determine the adaptation measures that are required to create the security at your ports, I think is incredibly important if we're to build on our location and actually take advantage of that of those competitive factors. The reality is our systemic risk assessment tool in the last 2 hurricanes was almost 100% correct in terms of what storm surge would look like, what flooding would look like from rivers and groundwater, as well as what wind damage would do. So the good thing is that we actually have a fair assessment of what risk level there is at each of our ports of entry. Now is to move that through partnerships, through investments with the IFIs to ensure that we build the strength to withstand what are now normal storms. We don't need to have theatrical coverage of these storms every time they happen. What we need to have is investment that comes before, during, and after that ensures that you're better prepared for the next one each time. It was useful to see some of the steps, or rather to discuss some of the steps yesterday in the tour in terms of how the Port of Miami actually approaches its own hurricane risk. And I think aligning with the Port of Miami to make sure that there is some amount of harmonization of measures, particularly useful right across the ports of the Caribbean to make sure that we're all using best practice.
So, Minister, what you're speaking about is the depth of policy that one has to have in order to create the right kind of response. So when investors and operators hear this vision, they would ask themselves, what does this actually look like? So could you share some examples of how Jamaica is future-proofing its maritime infrastructure, whether through design, renewable energy, integration, coastal protection? What are some of the things that you're actually moving on?
And I would say all of the above, as you'd have mentioned. I mean, we have commenced the process of buying a supercomputer to drive our systemic risk assessment tool, which will be the basis of our public investment appraisal, which looks at all of our port infrastructure and otherwise. Our major port, certainly for cargo, is indeed in Kingston, and we have completed a drainage plan that will, I think, positively impact the entire environs of the port and manage stormwater pretty well. We've also completed the studies, full study of what's required from a coastal revetment standpoint for storm surge up to 20 feet. And even though Kingston is unlikely to be the worst affected because of the closed nature of our harbor, we still were in all the worst circumstances and making sure that our infrastructure plan is indeed matching the risks that we face. And that goes for our cruise ports on the north coast, that goes for a commercial port in Montego Bay, and certainly is being contemplated for the development of other ports in and around the island. But we're very clear that every development has to be looked at through the climate lens to make sure that the dollars that we're able to raise, whether through partnerships, whether through our own debt, or whether it is through our consolidated fund, that we make sure that it is used in such a manner that builds resilient ports. We won't ever have the largest port, but we would like to have the most secure ports, the ones with the best energy rates, the ones with the best supporting services, so that we're able to function as a good partner for all of our sister ports.
So, Minister, you spoke about our visit yesterday and the meetings we had with various players. We even met a Jamaican who was part of the design team in building some of that resilience. So I think that the whole idea of the partnership between Florida, Port of Miami, and the Caribbean will be very important. So how do you think we can attract? What do we need to do to engage more with our partners so that we can move the Caribbean to where it needs to be?
So, partnerships are the name of the game. Whether it's with IFIs, whether it's with other, other countries, or whether it's even going to be at the regional level. There's no doubt that the Caribbean has a huge diaspora in Florida. So we have to establish and strengthen our partnerships with the state itself. We have to harmonize our security protocols with the state itself so that their companies and their commercial players are not at risk when they look at doing business with you. So we have to be very clear on the regulatory side in terms of harmonizing as much of our regulatory environment as we can, so that the players here can look at us as a reasonable investment destination. And it's always important through think tanks and fora like this, convened by the Atlantic Council, to get people together. There's nothing like knowing who to pick up the phone and call if you're going to trigger business and investment. People don't invest in Excel sheets without knowing the persons behind them, right? So ultimately, we do have to harmonize our regulatory environment. We do have to be speaking to each other. And we do have to share a vision, I think, if we're going to bring those partnerships together.
So finally, Minister, your Vision 2030, what does that look like for the Caribbean in particular? What does that look for Jamaica? And in terms of infrastructure durability, but as a modern competitive gateway, whether it is for global trade or tourism, and/or?
So generally for Vision 2030, I've said the easiest way to describe it is that you would want to make sure the state of development and the lived experience of citizens, certainly in Jamaica and in the rest of the Caribbean, is of such that your diaspora would be actively looking to come home, because there's sufficient economic activity and there's a sufficient standard of living that is comparable with your neighbors to the north. So I think Vision 2030, instead of going through the varying pillars that build it up, is just everyone wanting to come home. That doesn't happen without us leveraging our geographic strengths. And that has to be leveraged through increase and significant expansion of our logistics capacity. That has to be leveraged through destination assurance and improvements that drive even greater tourism business through the Port of Miami for cruise and for otherwise, so that, if we're at 3 million persons now, or 4 million persons choosing to visit Jamaica now, that we're at 10 in a few years. And that doesn't happen without partnerships, the ones we're exploring today.
So in closing, Minister, if you think there's one strategic shift we need to do in the Caribbean in order to secure that future, what do you think that should be?
We have to confront our risk profile. We have serious climate risk. We have to build with resilience in mind, and we have to do all that academics and engineers will guide us to make sure that our investments are best suited. But that risk profile also has a huge security risk, one that is the source of much geopolitical discussion now. But we have to confront it. If we're going to achieve Vision 2030, your security pillar has to be very strong. Your climate resilience has to be without question. I think that will form the basis of all the investments that will improve the standard of living and social services in all of our countries and lead to shared prosperity.
Thank you, Minister. And I think that what you've done is to lay the groundwork for the two panels that we're going to have now. And I think, thank you very much for joining us here at the Atlantic Council in Miami. And we look forward to working with you closely in the future as we move things forward.
Absolutely. And we invite the Atlantic Council, hint, to also look at hosting some of these fora in Jamaica, especially even in coming major international events like the Oceans Conference of 2027.
Never miss a beat, Minister.
Absolutely.
Please welcome to the stage our first panel, being moderated by Jason Marsack, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelists to come up to the stage, please. And I'll introduce, please go ahead and come and take open seating here. I'll take the seat right next to the podium. As we're doing that, I want to welcome everyone to this first panel on U.S.-Caribbean cooperation, investment on ports, trade, and infrastructure. Minister Samuda, thank you so much for your leadership and for sharing such a candid and forward-looking perspective on the strategic stakes in the region. And Patricia, your moderation was fabulous. As always, so proud to have you as a non-resident senior fellow and part of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center team. I want to begin by acknowledging, as well as Adrian did at the outset, two partnerships that have been essential to making this programming possible. First, Florida International University, and Brian, as outset, keyed up the Hemispheric Security Conference that will be from May 5th to 7th, and so pleased to be able to partner. And also Tropical Shipping, Tim Martin, Jennifer, who's here as well, the entire team, exceptional partners throughout all this maritime and ports programming that we've had frankly, for quite some time that's resulting in this conference today. So Tim, let me begin by introducing you. On the stage here is Tim Martin. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Tropical Shipping, which is one of the most established and trusted operators connecting the Caribbean and the United States. Next to Tim is Eric Bethel. Eric is General Partner at Mar Liberum Capital, which is an investment firm focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. Eric brings a real clear-eye perspective of a private investor who makes real decisions about where capital goes and why. And we were just talking about before the panel about some other investment opportunities we were thinking about here. Next to Eric is Adam Carter. Adam is Managing Director and Head of Investment Banking, FX, and Derivative Sales at CIBC First Caribbean International Bank. This is one of the Caribbean's largest and most deeply embedded financial institutions, and a partner for quite some time. So great to have you too, Adam. And sitting next to me is Deanne Bethel. Deanne serves as President and Chief Executive Officer at Our Work Port Development Limited, which is the operator of Nassau Container Port, one of the Caribbean's most significant transshipment hubs. So great to have you too, Deanne. I'm going to jump right into it. The Caribbean is, this panel, we're going to cover everything from trade and infrastructure, investment and finance, to strategy and strategic cooperation and security. But just to cue this up for this, what we have the next half hour or so, when you look, maybe a 1 minute answer, it's a flash round robin here. When you look at the maritime sector today, where do you see the greatest opportunity for deeper U.S. Caribbean cooperation? Essentially, what feels under leveraged? Maybe Tim, I'll start with you and work here with Pam. Just a quick 30-second to 1 minute answer to cue up the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Jason. Hear me? Okay,
Yes.
there we go. I would start by saying three things. Cruise terminals, cargo terminals, and airports all need, in the Caribbean basin, the infrastructure to support growth and the initiatives that we just heard from Jamaica to continue to grow in that market as well.
Fantastic. Cruise, cargo, and airports. Eric?
I would say technology, ports, maritime infrastructure, shipping is a very analog industry that hasn't changed in generations. And whether it's AI, robotics, autonomy, the future of anything that moves is going to be automatic. It's going to be autonomous. So thinking through where the puck is heading, if you're in the port or shipping industry, is very important.
Thanks, Eric.
I hate to do it, but I'm going to copy Tim. I think speaking as a Caribbean national and someone who lives there, the gateways are incredibly important. We import essentially everything, and we export hotel beds for tourists. So it's for locals, everything that we consume is brought in on through the gateways, and for the tourists, it's the first thing they see and the last thing they see. So that it starts and finishes the experience, and for too long they've been underserviced and in dire need of redevelopment.
Thank you. And exactly the point of this panel. So cruise, cargo, airport, technology. Dion?
Yeah, I think I'd have some overlap on that as well. I think when I look at it through the lens of APD and the service we provide would be a resilient supply chain. Many of our island nations depend on what we are supplied in terms of keeping us running through the U.S. and other countries. A resilient infrastructure. We sit on the border of the U.S. and the weather conditions over the years have impacted us negatively. Financing, a lot of our island nations use the ports as a gateway. These feed these small communities, and they're so dependent on it. And while the port infrastructure is critically important, the means to be able to afford a decent port in some of these small communities makes it a little difficult. We're going to have to find some innovative ways to be able to assist them with the financing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much, Dan. So financing, investment in cruise terminal, cruise, cargo, airport, technology, essentially what we're here to talk about today, and the importance of this. And Tim, let me begin to draw this down into an operational level. Tropical shipping has been connecting the Caribbean and the United States for decades. You've seen infrastructure up close across many islands, across many ports, across many years of change as well. From an operator's perspective, Tim, what are the infrastructure gaps that you think, if addressed, would most improve trade efficiency and reliability across the region? What are those choke points that you see as ripe for addressing?
Port terminal operations, we need modern freight equipment, high operational efficiency. We need advanced technology, which was mentioned here, to a whole different level. And we need technology to support customs clearance. For example, what does this all mean? Customers want their cargo as fast as possible. And today, in some of the ports in the Caribbean, vessel will discharge on a Friday. Customs is closed on Saturday and Sunday. They start the clearance process on Monday, and they don't get their cargo till Wednesday. So if you look at time value of money, it's such a delay throughout the Caribbean, it has a tremendous impact on the long-term profitability of local businesses and people.
Thanks, Tim. And that's important to hear that from you from a real operator's perspective on the challenges that are faced on a day-to-day basis. Continuing looking at trade infrastructure, Dion, I'll move to you. So Nassau Container Port sits at a generally strategic point in the Caribbean's maritime network. Maybe at some point we'll need to do delegation to see the container port there as well. You're operating really at the intersection of transshipment, logistics, and also regional connectivity. So from your perspective, Dion, what are some of the specific investments or operational reforms or policy shifts that could best position the Bahamas as a much more competitive maritime hub?
The cost of having the right equipment certainly starts at a good point. Having the right facility that would be able to receive, move cargo. Of course, when yard density is high, it makes it a little difficult. Security on the cyber side, I think is critically important, as well as intraport facility that impacts our partners on the port of origin and other intermediary ports. I think that is critically important and high. And another barrier would be, again, on the infrastructure. Our port entrance services twofold, cargo and cruise. And one of our biggest risks is port blockage, as well as our breakwater and the impact of that. So I think those things, if we were able to enhance that, would allow us to be able to be a bit more effective and efficient in being able to service our customers, and attaching some of those things that we see as drawbacks to KPIs that push team members to focus on those pain points to ensure that we're as efficient as we could to turn around that vessel as quickly as we could.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And we'll talk a little bit further about security over the course of the panel. But also, you mentioned investment. And let me go back to you, Eric, on that question, because infrastructure, of course, doesn't get built without financing. Financing also doesn't flow without the right conditions. So as you're looking, Eric, at the larger Caribbean region, you're making decisions about where real private capital should go. From your perspective, what makes Caribbean maritime infrastructure compelling right now, but also where do investors hesitate, and how can you overcome those hesitations?
Let me think about that so I can answer thoughtfully. First of all, what we do is we invest in critical technologies as applied to maritime. So we don't do, Mari Libram doesn't do infrastructure investments. In a previous life, I served as the World Bank director representing the US. And I think what the US needs to do is to create an enabling environment. And let's not forget, we have 3 borders in the United States. We have Canada, we have Mexico, and we have the Caribbean. And we don't think of the Caribbean as a border, but it's a very important border. And it's, it's under the, right next door to the US. US tourists transit through the Caribbean. I'm going to guess like 80% of the tourists in the Caribbean are American. Most people use the dollar. It is intrinsically tied to the United States. So it's up to whether the Development Finance Corporation, US Exim Bank, the State Department, and all arms of government to work to make this an enabling environment such that the private sector can go in. Unfortunately, the US moves way too slowly, and our adversaries like China move very quickly, and that's something we need to address.
Eric, on that point, I think we're starting to see signals that might be changing, right? That there is now this in the Trump administration a large focus on how to accelerate that investment in the Caribbean. There'll be a summit down here in a few weeks with Caribbean leaders. So it's really about how do we then galvanize all the different financial institutions that we have as the U.S. government has to be able to accelerate that investment capital. I want to turn to you, Adam. So CIBC is really as embedded in the region as really any financial institution is. You really understand what it takes, not just to fund a project, but also to structure it in a way that actually works. And that's absolutely essential, is how to structure those projects. How are you assessing the bankability of maritime infrastructure projects today?
Thanks. Yeah, great question. So we were fortunate enough to put infrastructure right at the top of how we prioritize our capital deployment. We've had various roles in almost any or every airport, cruise terminal, or container terminal asset in the Caribbean. We've used a various different financing structures to look at each one, whether they're public owned or private owned or some sort of PPP. Largely, we've recently played a role in some of the debt for climate swaps that have come about, and so ultimately what we're looking for, certainly if it's privately owned, is the economic and commercial viability of the port itself. Ultimately, lenders, creditors, capital providers want to understand how they get their return, and that they'll get for lender how we'll get our money back. And so, it's not necessarily rocket science, but I do agree with Dion. I think scale becomes a huge issue at times where you've got small islands, small ports. The volumes could be low, and the prices for that cargo and or head tax for the cruise passenger may not necessarily make sense in terms of a viability. And so you look at various states, supporters, multilaterals, sovereigns to assist with that. And to Eric's point, this truly is part of the third border. I think there's a huge opportunity there for economic enhancement to lead to all the other benefits that come back to protecting and unifying this part of the hemisphere.
And let me drill down a little bit more. What are some of the, if you could share some specifics, financing structures, risk sharing models, maybe even public sector commitments that you think would make projects even more viable?
Yeah, for sure. Fantastic. I think it starts at the procurement level. So especially when you're talking about PPPs, hugely complex, very long gestation periods, setting the rules and boundaries and guidelines for how you go and bid and award and select proponents for PPPs is hugely important. And then when you get into this beyond the selection and now the build out, making it viable. So if the port in and of itself is not large enough or doesn't have the economics on a standalone basis to support a financing or a capital structure, looking at enhancements through multilateral agencies, through government commitments, if it's a private project, looking at state interventions. There's a whole plethora of avenues and structures you can put in place to make a project bankable. Ultimately, the financial model will tell us whether we'll get repaid back or not, and ultimately creditors are going to look for the strength of that projections and to assess whether that's worth the investment. We have rarely had instances where we've seen a project not be bankable with the right interventions, to be honest with you. So the capital, I think, is the islands are very liquid. These projects also then attract US dollar international financing at times, or most of the time. And so financing largely is the liquidity is there to support a project.
Thanks so much, Ab. For those in the room, I'm gonna take a question or two toward the end of the panel. One of my colleagues will have a microphone. For those watching ACTV, you'll get to hear the questions from those here in the room. I want to shift to security and strategic cooperation because this conversation is about, of course, commerce, it's about investment. But it's also very much about security. And we've talked about this panel, the Caribbean being the third border, maritime infrastructure, supply chain resilience, energy security. It's really a question of also who controls some of these vital choke points in the Western Hemisphere. So Dion, let me shift back to you. From your perspective, how should security considerations shape U.S. Caribbean cooperation in port development and also in shipping? Really insofar as how do we invest, what standards, who do we partner with? How are you thinking about that? What's your recommendation?
So at the port, we ensure that our ISPS code is maintained, training amongst all of our stakeholders for them to recognize how important it is that if we lose that certification, it impacts not just APD, but the entire country. So security is paramount in terms of what is needed. What we realized was critically important was when we built the port, was to be able to put in the necessary infrastructure on the onset, despite the cost. So we could not compromise security over cost. It is much more expensive to layer it after the fact when you have to do an additional build out. On the cyber side, that one is painful for me. Part of my background has been IT. April 15, 2023, we were hit by a cyber attack. And that's crippling for a port and for a nation. Luckily, we had the necessary SOPs to be able to go manual, but we felt the brunt of what that would mean for us. And everyone thinks their arm is so robust until it happens, right?
Right.
And then it's so difficult to emerge out of it. And then you want to maintain the integrity of your entire yard infrastructure and systems. And so, the focus on security, that is not a like to have, that's a must in this environment.
Yeah, a few of us were over at Port Miami yesterday doing a tour, and as part of the presentation, security was fundamental to that. Something that was clear that Port Miami focuses on a day-to-day basis. Tim, I want to shift back to you as an operator, sticking on this line of questioning about security. How does security standards and compliance requirements influence your day-to-day operations, but also your investment decisions?
Well, security is paramount, as well as safety. Safety and security go hand in hand. So it has to be part of your total package that you have to look at. So you have different governmental agencies here in the U.S. like Coast Guard, Border Patrol, CTPAT, et cetera, that you have to meet all the standards that's required to be a safe and excellent service provider to all these port locations. And these port locations have to have the same standards. They have to have the proper fencing, they have to have the proper lighting, the proper control at your gates with the port infrastructure. And so that's paramount for the success of the port and safety, not only for people, but also for the goods and making sure illicit drugs, et cetera, doesn't get into your country.
Eric, how much does security figure into investment decisions?
Well, how much time do we have? All right, so
About
let me
15
just
minutes
sort
till
of,
the panel ends.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Let's just sort of like context set here. People look at security in buckets in different one unidimensionally, but we have to consider that when you have a ZPMC crane, ZPMC is a Chinese crane company. They control 80% of the market. Since 2024, ZPMC has sold 40% more in the Caribbean alone. The ZPMC crane has optical character recognition that can look and see what's happening at your port, and it can look and see where the containers are going. That is economic intelligence that's going straight back to Beijing. Beijing has a company called Lojink. It's offered for free to ports around the world, where it's port optimization software, again, going straight to Beijing. China has a company called NukeTech that does all of the scanning equipment, and they can tell what's inside of a container. So if China wants to send fentanyl precursors or, God forbid, weapons and missile systems, they know where it is, but we don't. In the case of, and part of it is on us. I mean, for crying out loud, we didn't have an ambassador in Dion's country in the Bahamas for what, like 8 years or something? Meanwhile, the Chinese built the ridiculous Bahia Mar, the Freeport container terminal. Even at a personal level, I go spearfishing in Chub Key, and right next door, there's a place called Bird Island that was bought by a Chinese industrialist, where we can't even take our boat over there because they have Chinese patrol boats telling us to go away. And Bird Island happens to be right next to where we do submarine training at the tongue of the ocean. So, I mean, and then don't get me, is anybody here from Antigua or know what's going on in Antigua? Yeah, so Exhibit A. So China has a special economic zone. I think it's like 2,000 acres or like 5% of the Antiguan territory, where a Chinese fishing company is helping the Antiguan Coast Guard patrol its own waters. They gave a stadium away for free. They did $100 million in housing. They built the airport. They rebuilt the port of St. John's, and now it's 100% Chinese controlled. So, and I can go on and on, but this is a really, really bad situation, and it's on us. Where have we been for the last 20 years?
Thank you, Eric. Adam, do you want to add any more to this question of security?
I mean, from a financing perspective, clearly it's paramount. It's in it's in the credit decisions at the highest levels. But I'd certainly agree, just maybe, taking off the financing perspective, but just from a local, just, keeping our sovereignty, I think is hugely important for us. And we should be careful, just generally about the participants in the market.
Well, I'll also go back to this summit, all the work that we've been doing over the course of a year or so with Tropical is all about how do we accelerate more investment into the Caribbean, and how do we accelerate more investment into Caribbean ports. And I think this conversation is showing the importance of why we need to be accelerating that investment. As we all know, the Caribbean also accounts for enormous trade with the United States, and there is incredible potential. But the investment has not followed. So I want a question for the full panel, and maybe I'll start with you, Tim. Where do you see the disconnect? Is it perception of risk? Is it project preparation? Is it scale, policy coordination? What's that choke point that's prohibited that necessary investment flowing in?
If you view it from the ports of the Caribbean, it's the unwillingness with the banking industry to do business with Caribbean nations. And if you look at it from the U.S. point of view, not being engaged, as was just mentioned, for the last 20 years. We didn't have an ambassador in the Bahamas for the last 8 years. And that has a lot to do with it. What can success look like? It can look like what's happened in Nassau, Bahamas, where Prime Minister Hubert Ingraham, at the time, and his government made a change. Bay Street is the main thoroughfare for tourism in Nassau. They took all the containers in the container ports off Bay Street and moved it to Airwakey, that Dion Bethel, who runs and was involved in building. And it made it a private-public partnership where investment came from the local people of the Bahamas, local business of the Bahamas, and the Bahamian government. And it's one of the most successful transformations of also then taking the ability to build cruise terminal in Nassau and take the cruise passengers from 2 million a year to 8 million a year because of that drastic change. So it helped the people of the Bahamas.
Thanks, Tim. Deanne, I'll turn to you then to share a little bit more with the audience, whether more about that example or further to the question about that disconnect and how do we address that?
Yeah, I think there has to be an intentional will. One of the biggest obstacles has been, and I'm sure continues to be, the cost of capital. In our banking system, we have mainly Canadian banks, and with a lot of the port projects, the construction risk is high, and many of them are not prepared to take on that level of risk. What we did was somewhat creative. With our PPP, it was the first time in our country's time where the government actually put up cash along with a private sector group. And the government is not involved in the day-to-day. And that has brought about tremendous efficiencies. As part of that financing model that we came up with, we took the company public. It was and is still the largest publicly traded company on our local stock exchange. So it has broad reach to the entire community. And then we have been able to, on the onset, the cost of the capital again was high, and our bonds we refinanced at a much lower rate. Once the investors realized that a lot of the risks that they weren't prepared to assume on the onset had been removed, it made it much easier and still is much easier in terms of being able to borrow funds at this time.
Thanks, Dion. We have about 10 minutes. If there's I'm going to ask continue this question with the other two panelists. But if there's a question from the audience, please motion, and someone from the team. Okay, there'll be a question over there in a moment. But let me continue that line of question with you, Adam. Where do you see that disconnect with why the investment isn't followed? Is it perception of risk? Is it preparation scale?
Yeah, it's multifaceted. I think if you just go back even further, largely, I think all islands sort of have faced this. Various islands are at different stages of it. They treat the gateways as crown jewels, and it's been very difficult to convince, for political or for other reasons to convince politicians to want to either privatize or go down the road of PPPs or other type of models whereby the asset can be allowed to be a free enterprise and be commercially available for private investment. That's been a real struggle. So I think we've seen that obviously of late with various projects. Bahamas has been a tremendous example. The minister, I think, may have left, but Jamaica's been at the early stages of that. And you've seen tremendous successes through PPPs. It's truly been in our estimation a win-win-win model for success. But you do see heavy reluctance still to that. That's why I think you probably led to other sovereigns and so on coming in, and while their ownership may be retained, you maybe question how much of that ownership really has been retained in the end, given the sort of the strings attached and sort of the depth of the infiltration of some of that penetration. But I think once you can get a project selected and identified for investment, it's I think there are risks to Dion's point that sometimes aren't acceptable out the gate, but by and large those criteria are pretty well understood, and projects and governments and proponents do come around to be able to setting up the right structures to get investment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. Eric, similar question to you insofar as investment not flowing, and what do you see as a major impact? Is it something we haven't talked about so far today?
Yeah. So if you think about a layer cake, right? You have different layers on top. The foundational layer of it should be energy. At the very, very tip, you have quantum computing, but you can't have that without all the other layers. And you can't have resilient port infrastructure or resilient transshipment hubs or logistics if you have 50 cent per kilowatt hour electricity. So fixing the energy problem, I think, is paramount and foundational.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to take the question. There's a question from the audience here. If you could just go ahead and introduce yourself, please, and ask your question.
Good morning, everyone. Gregory Hill, Acero Capital. First of all, congratulations to the Atlantic Council for having this very relevant discussion this morning. If we step back a bit and look at the origins of the ports in the islands, it's where majority of trade took place between the Americas and the rest of the world. Cities built up around the ports. Over time, cities grew, the ports grew in size. The state owned all of the ports. As years have passed, and changing economic environments in terms of trade, export of sugar, commodities, the balance sheets of the islands have, let's say, taken on more debt than the economic stability can afford. So the economic resilience of the region has come under some element of challenge. Ports are majority owned by the state. So how do the ports expand? Well, it's difficult to put the debt on the balance sheet of the islands. When you look at the port operators, their capex volumes are quite substantial for the size of their balance sheets. So, as Tim rightly said, there's an opportunity for capital to move into the Caribbean. But the question is, what's the enabling environment for it? So I think you guys are touching certainly on the most important issues. How can the U.S. and the Caribbean, with significant cargo, cruise passengers, people trafficking along that corridor, how can that corridor be credit enhanced? And so the question is, can from a U.S. policy perspective, get U.S. guarantees, DFC credit guarantees? You can get World Bank, MEGA insurance wraps for the offtake to meet debt service requirements. So I think the solution lies in a collaboration between private equity, state debt, local capital, and credit enhancement coming out of the U.S. for U.S. operators.
I think the question here is on how do we better facilitate that coordination across USG, right?
5 or 6 moving parts.
Someone want to take that question on?
I think you answered it. It was a great question, and it requires a whole of society to include, the U.S. government and its agencies, the multilaterals, everybody working in tandem, Caribbean Development Bank, et cetera.
Good, Dan, please.
To add to that, I think what we were able to do at APD. We had a MOU between the government and ourselves, and what that established is that it removed the government from the day-to-day. Government, there was no intent for them to be able to get in our sandbox. On the flip side of it, they benefit from certain fees and providing the land and also as a shareholder. What could be done a little differently is that, when you send out for building a port, you're going to get prices from one end of the spectrum to the next. And you need to be able to cut that to suit your need at the time. So with us, there was an option to build a port out on the southwest. It would have been 10 times more. And the big driver for us is that, hey, look, if I build this $500 million port, how will this impact the price of eggs in the food store? Because it has to be paid for, yeah? All that gets rolled into the cost. So you have to come up with some creative ways to value engineer without compromising, again, the integrity of the infrastructure that you're prepared to invest in. Not every island nation would have the same model. Each one would be uniquely different, even though that gateway, that infrastructure in terms of that port, some have deep water harbors, some may not. So it is uniquely different, and you have to be able to find that right model for that particular.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deanna. I want to close with a final question to Adam and to Eric. But Adam, starting with you, let's drill down. I want to drill down a little bit more on public-private partnerships. What do you see as the art of the possible? What role could PPPs play in further accelerating port and logistics investment? Where do you see the opportunities of what's working, and how do we further accelerate?
Yeah, no, I think the PPP model, to my point earlier, is really the win-win model, and I think to the extent that we can convince governments and through state intervention and other parties, like case examples by technical assistance, various sort of support programs, perhaps credit enhancements and other tools that could be needed to make it investment friendly, just to showcase the win-win-win opportunity. It's been a huge success where we've seen it throughout the Caribbean, and I think promoting how other islands or parts of the world have used that could be hugely beneficial to showing what the art of the possible is for different islands.
And picking up on that, last question to you, Eric, what are some of the guardrails that you see that are necessary to make sure that these partnerships are transparent, that they're accountable, but also that they're built to last over time?
If you travel to many parts of the world, as I have, whether it's Africa or Sri Lanka or wherever, the Chinese have built a road or a bridge. Within 18 months, that road is washing away. And so I think what we need to do is to factor in, it might have been cheaper to build a Chinese road, but over the long term, it's going to be much more costly. So that's something to factor into procurement, whether it's at a multilateral bank like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, or whether it's a government thinking about the next infrastructure you build. In terms of other guardrails, we have an institution called MCC. It's the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for those of you that haven't heard of it. What they do is they give out grants, and the grants are not inconsequential. They're like, in some cases, $500, $600 million. But you have to, the country that receives that grant has to abide by a certain set of principles that are, to some degree, guardrails to maintain transparency and good governance.
Thank you so much. And I personally seen some of these investments from China across the region and seen kind of cracks in the walls within only a few months and other challenges. I think we have to close the panel. But I think what we've been able to cover in the last 35 minutes is a whole range of topics, everywhere from the importance of how do we accelerate investment, how do we accelerate commerce, what are some new models to be able to do so, how is it working, how do we build on those models, but also the importance of investment and how that flows alongside security. And when we think about security concerns, not just kind of the hard security, but also, Dion, you were mentioning the cyber attack that you faced, and Eric, you're also mentioning the importance of security and some of the decisions and the technology opportunities that also come into play with the ports as well. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Again, Tim Martin, Eric Bethel, Adam Carter, and Dion. Tim Martin, Dion Bethel, Adam Carter, Eric as well. I think this has been a really rich conversation. What I'm going to do now is we're going to turn over to Jeffrey Hall. Jeffrey's going to moderate a second conversation. Jeffrey is Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of Pan Jamaica Group Limited. He's also a leading figure in Jamaica's financial and corporate sector and chairman at Kingston Worth. So please, a round of applause for our panel.
Please welcome to the stage Mr. Jeffrey Hall.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists to the stage as well. Lilia Brunchiot, our country director for the Caribbean for the World Bank. Felipe Esquerra, the head of transport at the IDB, Transport, Infrastructure, and Energy. Mr. Andrew Lutz, the head of economic development in Asia. Captain Gus Anderson, associate vice president, port development, global marine operations, Royal Caribbean Group. Pedro Carmelo, senior executive, regional management office for CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. Yes, I'm going to try to make a very brief case for relevance, and then I'm going to speak to the panel. So what was said at the last panel is relevant. So we're starting out with an observation that the United States has the largest economy in the world, $31 trillion. The US has been very explicit about a Western Hemisphere mandate. There's $2 trillion of trade in the Western Hemisphere. And it's been more explicit about a maritime action mandate, which involves supply chain, which involves strategic assets. The Caribbean has a trade surplus, say about 12 billion, and it is the world's largest cruise destination with 35 million people visiting the region every year. So we have assembled a panel that can speak very directly to the capacity needs of the region from the standpoint of development finance, from the standpoint of the reasons that foreign direct investment builds capacity, how they make choices about where the capacity is built, and we have users of the facilities in the Caribbean. So with that, I'd like to open our panel. Thank you. So the matter before us is how do we get this capacity built in the maritime sector? What does it mean on the ground? What does it mean from the standpoint of finance? And I'd like to open that question with Lilia from the World Bank and to ask her, what capacity gaps are we targeting? What capacity gaps do we see? What are the capacity gaps that are most critical? And importantly, where is the lowest hanging fruit that we need to address on Monday morning?
Thank you. I would like to start with mentioning that I see capacity in a broad sense, not just capacity in terms of skills and the professional capacity of people who operate in this area, but the capacity of the whole maritime industry in the Caribbean. And I think the first thing that I think are clear about, and it was clear from the discussions earlier, is that we need to recognize that we have a problem, a joint problem. The cost of trade and logistics in the Caribbean is among the highest in the world. And this is not only because of infrastructure, which is far behind in many parts of the Caribbean. This is first and foremost because of the basics that need to be fixed. The basics in terms of rules and regulations, in terms of institutions, the basics in terms of trade facilitation. We need to recognize that these issues, institutional system issues, are not the port's only agenda. We have many institutions operating at the ports. We have the customs, we have the safety inspections, we have many other agencies that operate there. So we need to make sure that it is a mechanism that work all together. It's integrated, it's coordinated, it's not only ports. Then the second basic thing is, what is the authority of the port? Very often the port itself is, in a way, the second actor. The customs or immigration serve as the more important actors there. So it's very important to define what are the responsibilities, what is the authority, and then to measure the accountability of each of these actors on a joint result, not separately. We heard in the panel earlier about the delays because the customs is closed during the weekend, and this all impacts the cost of trade and the cost of logistics, which, by the way, then is reflected in the cost of food, in the cost of building materials, is reflected in the cost of running the economy and creating the opportunities there. And then also, as part of the fixing the basics, is transparent rules and regulations and tariffs and everything that has to do, inspections and so on, everything that has to do with the rules and regulations, which is critical for the private sector to invest and critical for lowering the costs. And by the way, someone mentioned earlier about the cost of energy. This is also part of the basics because the cost of energy is impacting the overall cost of tariffs. And then after you fix the basics, hopefully it will have an impact on the efficiency of the port operation. And before you start thinking about investing in physical capacity, you need to see what you can fix and how you can fix the efficiency, the operation of the port. And then after that, you can think about crowding in private investment because no PPP is going to really work to your advantage if you are able to attract the private sector unless you fix the basics that I just mentioned before. And then you can talk about the skills, because the skills are important, management skills, so that you have the right skills, that the people who run the day-to-day activities, electricians, and so on, which also are scarce on the islands. And finally, The point I would like to make is think about dealing with the issues regionally, not just on a country-by-country basis. You will not find enough capacity and people on each, because just the labor markets are so constrained. Think about corridors like the Eastern Caribbean corridor and see how you can enable this type of regional cooperation in all aspects, skills, but also attracting the private sector. Sorry, that was long.
It was very helpful. So Captain Gus Anderson from Royal Caribbean, Lilia says to us, it's not just about bricks and mortar and port infrastructure. It's about institutions. It's about people skills. It's about a regional framework. It's about customs and port authorities and everything else. Is that the experience of Royal Caribbean when you obviously operate regionally and you have as good a perspective as anybody? What are you seeing when you confront the Caribbean? Are you seeing this workforce readiness issue? And if so, how do you see it evolving? How do you make a difference?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. One of the only shipping companies here, I think it's us and Tropical, that are here today. So thank you so much for inviting us. There are always room for improvement, and we are here to find those areas where we could possibly increase the ties and increase the cooperation between the whole region, between the US, the Caribbean, and all the islands and all the countries in the area. And I think there's definitely a lot of things that we can learn from each other. There are certain parts of the Caribbean that are working better than others, and I think that the main thing here is that we get the whole buy-in from everybody on the islands, and that we can learn within the group of what is working well. And getting the buy-in, I mean, I mentioned it earlier here, that it needs to be so ingrained into everybody in the different countries that this is what we are going to do that I call it the lunch person, the person that prepare the lunch for the person that maintain the vehicles for the tour for the tourist. Of course, we are a tourist company. We bring in a lot of tourists. But if we can get that ingrained in the whole island, that this is good, maritime is good. If we can have officers and engineers from the islands, it's very seldom that I have sailed with somebody that is from the Caribbean on the ships. We have on the hotel side, but on the nautical or engineer side, it's very seldom. I think I only had 2, maybe 3 over the 35 years I've been at sea. So that is something that can definitely increase. The US have some schools, the Caribbean have, as far as I know, I could be wrong here, but the only one that I'm aware of is the one in the Bahamas, of nautical school that are, in Jamaica, yes. Very good. So there's a couple of them, but there's not a lot, and we don't see a lot of the influence there. That was just one of the examples that we could increase on and that we could help on, as well as the management, as well as the people that are working in the ports with whatever it is. From our side, it would be the ones that are meeting the guests. Hospitality. We are all in some way or another within the hospitality industry. And to have that understanding that whatever we do is affecting our friends, our neighbors, our family, with how we are receiving our guests, how we are receiving our customers, whether that's a cargo company or a cruise company. I think there is something that we all can become much better.
Thank you, Captain. So you're saying take a regional view, get buy-in, participate, identify what's working. Let's zoom out for a little bit from our region and take a comparative perspective. We have with us Mr. Andrew Klutz from Tractus Asia. And they, among other things, guide foreign investment, foreign direct investment. How do you see it from the outside in? I know that you obviously have a perspective on this region for sure, but when you make a comparison with what is happening and works well in Asia, what can we learn from the perspective of workforce development or capacity building when you look at our region?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. As you said, I I am looking at this from the side of corporate industrial companies who are looking for locations to invest. And obviously, port maritime activities are critical for many of these organizations. So, but that's not the only part. I mean, obviously, there needs to be connectivity to industrial zones and skills and staff and you know, cost-effective electricity and so on and so forth. So, at the sort of 30,000-foot level, when we do site selection or location analysis, we are typically don't start with one country. We're looking at a region. And our job is to get down into the numbers and the data and all the information that we can collect from a variety of sources. Of course, each country can make it a lot easier by digitizing lots of bits and pieces, and we can talk about that later. But the point is that we start to look at it at a regional basis, and then we work our way down, and eventually ending up in one country or island nation in this case, based on the criteria of the company, and we weight priority that based on the activity and the priorities of those activities and costs and so on and so forth. So we get down to a finalist location, and there may be multiple locations within a country if it's big enough, and there may only be one if it's a small island nation. But that's how we work it. And one of the things I would say is that I always encourage our government clients that we also advise on from the other side is to do reverse site selection, to think about looking at your assets and what you're offering from skills to industrial parks to ports, et cetera, and look at it from how a company is going to evaluate you. What are the numbers? What are the characteristics? What type of data do you have? It doesn't have to be the most in my region. It has to be enough for the type of activity that you're trying to attract. And another critical component here is scale. Scale is absolutely critical in the Caribbean. We have to know what each island nation is capable of attracting and not be going after something that you'd never have a chance for, because that's just a waste of time. So when we go back and we look at locations in Asia and what we've understood, I think the training component is the point that I focused on here, is that you have quite a few nations working very, very hard on vessel and port training systems, and that's everything from Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, South Korea, and other ASEAN nations such as Vietnam, et cetera. Some of those training programs come from international organizations or collaborate with international organizations, IMO, UNCTAD, ICO, De Norsk Veritas, et cetera. However, Singapore stands out as one location that has a plethora of training programs. By my count, I think I counted about a dozen or so, and I won't go into all the details here, but we have training for mid-career staff. We have SGI, the Singapore Maritime Foundation, that focuses on data analytics, AI, cybersecurity, sustainability. We have another one that's working on electrification and how that comes into play for vessels and other activities at the port. A third one, which is working on transformation in the industry, job redesigns, training, and so forth. And then it goes on into port operations, safety, et cetera. So there's a whole host of skills that are being addressed here, from basic operating skills on up to digitalization, automation, and cybersecurity. But I think Singapore is a location that we can learn a lot from in terms of how they've structured their training and capacity building, and also how they work with international organizations to bring that forward and be competitive.
Well, I want to come back to your point about digital information or digital transformation being a driving force for the decisions that are made. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we're zeroing in on the right point. Would you say, when you look at a place like Singapore and its maritime sector, which is obviously huge, the defining characteristic that allows for FDI in that maritime sector is, would you say that skills is the defining characteristic, or you also reference scale? What makes the difference? Just to be clear.
The bottom line is throughput, moving boxes quicker. And how you get there is through, human skills, automation, digitalization, planning systems, the whole 9 yards. So they, as you probably know, I mean, the Singapore story and how it was built and structured and designed was very, very purposeful. And they've been able to bring things, perhaps it's because it's a small location, very dynamic location, but they've been able to bring things together very rapidly to ensure success. And I think that's a critical component when we talk about the multiple elements that come into play for bringing an economy up vis-a-vis a maritime and port system, but also just general economic development health, is how do you bring those elements together? And Singapore, and there's other examples out there. Morocco has done a very nice job with their industrial activities, but also let's not ignore their port activity. Tangermed is amazing, and that's all because of a very well-developed government strategy over 20 plus years. So this is not a short-term game; it's a long-term game. But being able to keep chipping away at that.
Okay. So, Mr. Felipe Esquerra, Andrew Klutz says, look, at the end of the day, you got to move boxes quicker. Let's not confuse ourselves. And there's an ecosystem that includes technology that's part of the driver. You have lots of money. The IDB is a major investor in the region, not the only one on this panel. How do you see that from your perspective? What are the preconditions to putting the financial resources to work to allow technology to transform the operations of ports to move boxes quicker?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Well, first, IDB Invest, we are the private sector arm of the IDB Group, the Inter-American Development Bank Group. And basically, we in IDB Invest support projects across the region developed through the private sector. And we work joined with our colleagues in the IDB, where they provide support directly to the countries through sovereign guaranteed loans and all kind of technical assistance, including, and has been said, is a key element supporting the governments in structuring PPP projects. We in IDB Invest has been focused in the recent years in supporting investments in the development of new ports and the expansion of existing ports across the region. We have supported the development of some quite large new terminal container ports in the region, for example, in Posorja, in Guayaquil, in Colombia, or the port of Urabá in the Gulf of Urabá in the north of Colombia. In the Caribbean, we have financed the construction and development of the new Kingston container terminal through a concession contract, and we are, of course, currently supporting the port of Barbados in expansion and improvements in the port. And of course, technology is a part, is a key element of those investments. It's not just the construction of the port, is financing the whole investment to the port work in the more efficient way. Then all kind of technologies from, I don't know, automation of operations to security, to digital control of all the movements in the port are part of the investments that we finance. But going to your question, we understand that investing in the development of PCS, of port community systems, including, for example, maritime single windows, that type of investments are of utmost importance for improving efficiency of port operations, because it's the way in which you try to put all the stakeholders to work together, not just thinking in the port itself. And just to bring here another example, currently the IDB, the private sector side, they are supporting the government of Suriname in the development of a port community system for the port of Paramaribo, and also in the same project, also including the investments to improve the road access to the port. At the end, you need to think in the whole ecosystem of the port and trying to include all the stakeholders more than just looking specifically to the port itself.
Thank you very much, Felipe. So what I hear you saying is, from the perspective of IDB Invest, you're deploying capital in Colombia, you're deploying capital in Kingston, in Paramaribo, in Barbados, and part of that capital is being deployed and should be deployed to allow for technological transformation. Things like a port community system are going to move boxes faster. I just wanted to pivot to Pedro Ravello from CAF, Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, and ask him, in the context of what's been said by IDB Invest, from your perspective at CAF, what's the structure of these investment deals? What do these deals look like? How can a Caribbean country interact with CAF or any other development financial institution to harvest capital to allow for this transformational change? What should we be thinking about from that perspective?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us today. I bring regards and greetings from Stacy Richard Kennedy, our regional manager for the Caribbean, and also for my colleague Fausto Arroyo, which is our port specialist. So thinking about structuring let's say the right way to finance this type of investment, I would like to think in stages. First, I think that before even thinking about the CapEx and the cranes and all of that, we need to make sure that we devoted enough time and resources to planning. And for us, we provide technical assistance and also support the government and other stakeholders in project preparations. And with that, we want to fund like the governance designs of the port, which pretty much is related to having the PCS and the maritime single window, having also like a map of the process, having a data architecture and how to share that information. Also thinking about cybersecurity and continuing planning and for events that happens, sometimes unexpectedly, especially in this region. Be also ready for the procurement. We want to ensure that the rules and regulations are set up since the beginning, because all these elements are the ones that will then allow us to have a successful project. No? It also will give us good information about the technology that we need, the partners that we need to identify, and the scale of the investment itself. Also, a good practice, not only in the Caribbean, but I would say that in the whole Latin American region, is thinking in stages, in stage investments. So, for example, first we need to lay out the foundation of the connectivity of what this port is going to bring in the whole region and the integration of this port to other regional ports. We need to think about operations, optimization. We need to think about interoperability and how to measure this. This is a crucial element in reducing the risks that are related to these investments. And also, I would say maybe and the third layer of the structure of how we think about structuring this deal is to blend finance. How can we crowd in private capital and reduce risk in this type of projects? No? And I think there's a lot that can be done in this regard. For example, what is the best structure? How do we combine sovereign and non-sovereign lenders with guarantees and some other performance-based instruments and some targeted technical assistance that allow us to reduce the risk of these projects and make it viable, not only economical, but also financing and bankable. And this is important, especially in this market that are small and that has a higher risk execution perceived by some of the market participants. Also, it's very important when designing the contract, let's say, for example, a concession or even the loan on the financing agreement, trying to link incentive to outcomes. So, for example, how can we tie KPIs such as dwell time reductions and system availability, stakeholder integration, cybersecurity, and so forth, within the contract, so we can align the incentive to the outcomes that we want to achieve in this investment. And finally, at these stages, and I mentioned that a little bit at the beginning, is that how do we support regional integration and interoperability? And this is very important for the Caribbean, and we all know, with the work that CAF has done in the digital work and also in the port area in the Caribbean, it underscores the importance and the value of having this interoperability and have an integrated ecosystems within the ports and the region itself. So in a nutshell, that's what we see, how can we structure this type of investments, even from the public side or the private side, not only in the region, but I would say in the wider region as well.
Okay, so we heard from Minister with responsibility for a wide range of development aspects of Jamaica, that from the perspective of Jamaica, there is an appetite to invest in development of the maritime sector in a way that is comprehensive along the lines you described, but it also includes climate resilience, obviously technology, and ultimately will move boxes faster. We heard more generally at the prior panel a perspective that the U.S. ought to have interests in the Caribbean for supply chain management, for national security, for economic growth, et cetera. Can we get a view from you at CAF and also IDB Invest and the World Bank on your appetite for deploying capital in the maritime sector in the Caribbean? Where do you see a strong willingness to deploy capital, and where are you somewhat reticent?
Thank you.
I'll ask you each in turn
okay, sorry.
the same question. Please.
Okay. So I think that we have an important appetite in the region. We want to also build on some of the other experience that we have in other Latin American countries and how to bring the best practice to the region and things that work in similar environments to the region. For example, in Jamaica, we're working with Jamaica Special Economic Zone and how to develop the Caymanas Special Economic Zone and how to develop these special economic zones and how to take advantage of Jamaica's geographic location and within the maritime lines of shipments and transport as well. So and how to, but also from the vision that supply chains is changing, the trade environments have changed a lot, and how can Jamaica can adapt and take full advantage of these opportunities that also opens for the country. In the rest of the region, we are looking with very closely about the investment that have been developed in Trinidad, in expanding the port and modernizing the port, as well as Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda. I think that it's also a very interesting case for us. We recently are working in Bahamas as well. We tied to the energy sector and how the energy sector can support a better and more efficient operation for the port sector as well. You mentioned on the panel before, the energy sector is very important in order to have an efficient operation in the port sector and how to reduce the cost overall of shipments to our countries. So maybe
let me go to Lilia Brunswick. And I'll come back to you in a moment, Felipe. But when you look when the World Bank looks at it, presumably it takes a very broad policy angle in addition to the sheer deployment of capital. You know, what's your appetite for deploying resources in the Caribbean? What do you see as the obvious constraints that governments and other actors need to think about?
We see this as a very important sector for us. As we've been discussing today, 95% of everything that comes to the islands and leaves the islands goes through the ports. This is key for the development of these economies and the future of these economies. And we also need to face the realities of the day that countries are small and the scale is small. So for this very small scale, you need to be even more efficient than bigger countries that can maybe afford a little bit more of inefficiencies. And third, it has to be a regional solution, because there is no way of dealing with the diseconomies of scale than create a bigger scale. And that's why I think it's very important to look at it at the regional level. And it doesn't need to be the whole region in one scheme. It can be sub-schemes, like I mentioned earlier, the Eastern Caribbean maybe corridor, or it can be, I don't know, Jamaica with the Dominican Republic and some others, looking into the regional possibility of creating regional hubs, or the oil producers, Trinidad and Tobago with Guyana and Suriname. So think regionally. And also interoperability is very important, because the private sector, when the private sector comes, they look for scale, they look for efficiencies, and they also, and interoperability is part of it, and they also look for very clear rules of the game and transparency. And this is, you asked about the low-hanging fruit, and this is important to attract the private sector and for actors like the World Bank and others to be involved in attracting private capital and investment into the sector, is for the rules of the game to be very clear. The low-hanging fruit, in my view, is one, and I already mentioned it, make sure that institutional setting is clear, create one maritime window, customs, everybody working as one body and not different interests pulling into different directions. And this politically is very difficult, because there are lots of interests there that will be difficult to overcome. And then work a low-hanging fruit, which is also maybe difficult, but it doesn't require a lot of resources, is, as I already said, acting regionally, and then make sure that you create regional platforms. And finally, I would say try to create some regional platforms, like there is a regional facility that was created for the energy sector, renewable energy sector in the Eastern Caribbean, to de-risk the private investment. Because as we were discussing earlier, bankability of investments of projects is an issue. And creating, de-risking the projects, making sure that there is good project preparation capacity, and also making sure that there are sources, that the World Bank, the CAF, and others are working together so that we support these investments in these projects. And there is more information about, sorry, I'm rambling here a bit, but there is quite a lot of information about the renewable energy facility that was put in place. We can use the same mechanism for ports in the region. So let me stop here. Thank you.
No, that was very helpful. And you mentioned scale, you mentioned interoperability, you mentioned regionalism. I don't think we could have a better representative view of that than Royal Caribbean. But before I go there and get your perspective, Lydia, you didn't mention something that the panel started out with, or the day started out with, which was climate resilience. And when you look at the Caribbean, is that a distraction or a kind of a non-relevant consideration, or is it something that you see as top of mind? How should we think about that part of the discourse?
So resilience is the name of the game in the Caribbean. We know that because of the frequent natural disasters, and it's not only hurricanes, it's volcanoes, it's earthquakes, and so on. But resilience is not just building seawalls, which are very important, and building resilient infrastructure, which is also very important, so that port can withstand, I don't know, maybe a Category 5 hurricane. Resilience is also about building systems that work. Resilience is also about security and cybersecurity, which is very important. So, of course, this makes the investments in the maritime and port infrastructure in the Caribbean more expensive. But as we know, more expensive investments upfront will save a lot of money going down the road. And I'll just give an example, not from this sector, but from the housing sector, that every dollar spent on resilient housing saves $6 down the road. And I think more or less the same ratio may apply to infrastructure in ports. Thank you.
Felipe, your appetite from the perspective of IDB Invest, and where do you see the constraints?
Well, first, some concrete messages. Well, first, of course, all that have to do with ports and connectivity and regional integration is one of the key strategies for all the IDB group, IDB and IDB Invest. Then, of course, we have full appetite to support projects.
Full appetite?
Yeah. In our case, as I explained, we provide financing for projects that are developed through the private sector, and that, of course, connect with a lot of things that have been done regarding the countries deploying more PPPs or concession frameworks, and then is the way to attract the capital, the private capital, start upstream. But we, in that sense, we have full appetite. The second message is that I would like to share is that we, in this case in IDB Invest, we have a specific target of our annual budget to deploy at least 10% of our capital in the Caribbean.
And what's your capital?
We, for example, in the infra energy division, that can mean probably something around $300 million. That can look not a very large amount, but I can guarantee that finding opportunities to support infra projects in the Caribbean for that amount is very difficult. But in any case, we have that target, not just only for infra, but for the whole IDB Invest. And that is something that started, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. And currently we are deploying more than that 10%. And then, but just to to say how supporting the Caribbean countries is another pillar, a strategic pillar of our work. And then, yeah, I think that the thinking in the private sector side, the key element is, and has been explained, is have to do with the need of the countries starting with a more strategic view, and then to deploy solutions that permit the private capital to come, and that have to do with preparation, with regulation, and to deploy good projects in the market. Then when the projects are there, and was explained before, then the capital come. And then in that sense, we are absolutely committed to deploy capital in the Caribbean, and specifically in the maritime sector. And we see some, and we can talk later about that, but was taught the problem of the cost of energy. But if you think in ports, the question, and we are trying to work jointly with our IDB colleagues, with the countries, in the sense that we think that is needed to have a more holistic approach in the countries, in the sense to put the ports in the center, or a key element in the energy planning. At the end, the ports are consumers of energy, and if you think, for example, in the carbonization of the maritime industry, and you think in the projects in the ports providing shore power to the cruise industry, and then most of the countries simply do not have the energy, and then that creates of course a good space for us in the sense of trying to help the countries to structure projects that can be financed and that can at the end benefit the maritime industry and the sustainability in the long term.
Can you talk a bit more about what you said, you know, in relaying the constraints? You obviously mentioned that it's challenging to find projects to deploy capital. And you also referenced a gap in, as I heard it, in strategy, meaning that national governments need to formulate a strategy. Now, the Caribbean finds itself, somebody in the prior panel called it the third border. It finds itself as this third border with the world's largest economies, 50% larger in nominal GDP than China. But yet there's this concern. This world's largest economy has said explicitly that it wants to see a kind of a Western hemispheric mandate. And within that, it wants maritime development. And it wants to do business with countries with whom it has a trade surplus, such as the Caribbean. Why is there this strategic gap that you're seeing, and what do we need to do to get Caribbean governments to focus on resolving the strategic gap?
Well, it's a very good question with difficult answer. But I would say is that it's not a problem or a situation that we see specifically in the Caribbean. We see the situation all across Latin America, and of course have to do with political decisions and at the end political I don't know, interests, and also have to do with in general we can call with skills. At the end, the countries I don't know, to structure a model for PPPs need specific skills and financing that and putting the financing that in that area. And of course, of course I know all the multilaterals, the World Bank, the IDB, are trying to support the governments on that. But at the end, the governments need to take the decision that is when I call this more strategic view is that at the end, the decision to do that need to come from the countries. You can explain, you can try to put examples, to share best practices, to explain exit situations where you can show projects that have been developed and are going well, but at the end, the countries need to take the decisions.
Thank you. You know, Captain Anderson, there are structural issues such as scale and regional integration and interoperability. And then there is these questions of strategy and skills and execution, all of which represent to some level constraints. But what we heard from our development bank panelists is an unambiguous appetite to deploy capital in the region. Now, it would seem to me that Royal Caribbean would have an answer for the question of scale. You know, I think you probably do maybe 30% of the passengers in the region. And you would have an answer for regionalism because you operate across a region. And you would have an answer for interoperability because you have a perspective on how the ports line up and how you think about security across the region when you go to ports. So how would you want to see the money that's available deployed in the Caribbean from somebody who has resolved the question of scale and interoperability and regionalism?
So I have been on stage many times as a captain on the biggest cruise ships in the world. Usually I get the question, who's driving the boat? And now you're putting me in this one here. That's quite of a difference here in the way of answering question. So of course, I believe that the whole cruise industry, and it's difficult to go into too much details here in a short time, but obviously there is a lot of appetite to expand the capacity in the Caribbean, and to have we are building a lot of ships. The industry are building a lot of ships.
Just to be clear, my understanding is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Royal Caribbean is leading in the development of so-called mega ships. Is that a fair statement, or?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And presumably those require very significant investment infrastructure. They create a huge opportunity for the region, and they obviously require security, and they require other elements. So with that, how do you see us speaking to the development banks as Caribbean?
Well, of course, we always looking for places to take the ships, and there is a capacity for cruise ships, specifically during the winter months when they come from other places over to the Caribbean. There is a capacity cap that is about to be reached, and Royal, I presume our competitors are doing the same thing, looking for different places. The trend for the last little while has been to go into private destinations where we are, I would say, to a large extent, almost always, we are with a partner in those. Yeah. So therefore, there is an appetite to continue doing that in different places, and we constantly look for new places in the Caribbean, as well as over in Asia as well, where we are looking for it, to have it. So you asked about the appetite earlier here. We have a pretty big appetite. We're hungry.
Andrew, you have this appetite from private investors, from development institutions. Obviously, we've highlighted gaps. Can you help us just to paint a picture of what good looks like based on your experience, both from the standpoint of attracting investment and also what an outcome might look like in the region if we were to get it right? Help us to understand what a Caribbean port could achieve if we were to have the strategy that Felipe referenced and have the dollars that CAF is willing to deploy in the context of the policy frameworks that Lilia referenced.
Sure. again, not everything is of equal size. So there are larger ports and there are smaller ports and larger islands and more population and so forth. So that always comes into play with the Caribbean, and it really needs to be acknowledged as such. And I think this concept of being able to map and regionalize what we have in this place called the Caribbean or the Caribbean Basin, and begin to kind of make a sort of a multi-layer map in terms of what are people's roles. And sometimes it's going to be disappointing for some organizations or countries that are want to do more, but in reality, this is what they've got. They don't have a deep water port. They don't have enough people. Their objectives are just not realistic. So if I think about, and I thought a little bit about this, and there are quite a few ports in the Caribbean that have been very successful and are working hard today to grow their capacity and their services. And we can talk about Cologne, we can talk about Cartagena, we can talk about Kingston, but I wanted to look at one that I know fairly well, and I felt kind of encompasses a lot of the things that my customers or our investors would want to see in terms of what is happening, right? And that is Caucedo in the Dominican Republic. And it's an interesting port development because it involves DP World on the private side, a very well-established terminal operator. It involves Dominican money, it involves the Dominican government, so you have a little bit of a PPP here. And that's, for me, is very interesting. They just announced that they're putting about $750 million in 2025 over the next few years.
Could you restate the number?
750 million US. And that's to grow, their berthing areas and add cranes and automation and so forth. And they'll go from about 2.5 to 3.1 TEUs. But on top of that, and probably more interesting for our customers, is not just the port itself, but the fact that DP World is moving beyond terminal operation, and they're getting involved in logistics, and so they've built out quite a few warehouses, and they have plans to add more on the site of the port. It's 225 hectares, so it's quite a large site. Also sits on the peninsula with the airport. So now you have intermodal activity going on. On top of that, in this logistics facility, not only can you have warehousing there, but you can do manufacturing. So effectively, it's a special economic zone. And so there's the special economic zone within Caucedo. Right across the street, there's another one called Las Americas, and San Isidro is not too far away, and there are a few others on the other side of Santo Domingo. So within a 40-kilometer, circle, you probably have about 5 or 6 special economic zones that provide for investors a very nice umbrella to plug into because it's turnkey. Not only do you have facilities, but you have hiring, you have payroll, you have security, you have fire, you have transportation for the workers, and then you have this direct connect to the port. All digitalized, and containers can be sealed at site, and you don't have to worry about it. It's a very efficient process. So for me, this is quite interesting. And the other thing that it brings up is you were probably on the call that we had a few months ago, and one of the comments that I really thought was a very good one. I can't remember who brought it up. Maybe perhaps you raised it, but someone raised the concept of Gulf money or a fund to support port activities. And, we're seeing an example here with DP World of Gulf money being put to work in a very nice growing operation. And I think the concept that was raised on the call was that there had been some folks talking with people from Qatar and Saudi, and I would think UAE would be involved as well, Kuwait, because it's another pool of money that is very involved in port activities, transportation, logistics, and in global growth. And as we see the world today, and we see these sort of pockets of influence, you know, from China to the US to Russia and so forth, these sort of sit in between. They're agnostic. And they have money. And so, again, you know, that's something I think from a greater sort of regional strategy, we should look closely at. Because we have examples like Caucedo, where it's gone quite well.
It was a beautiful answer. As a Jamaican, I don't know whether to be intimidated or motivated by the way you characterize. Go with motivated? Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, thank you for the advice. So I'm gonna go with motivated, and then since I have this esteemed panel here, from the perspective of, let's take any Caribbean regional port authority, port owner, operator, public policy expert, emphasizing the maritime sector. In closing, I'm going to ask each of you, since we're going to go with motivated, one practical thing, like one Monday morning activity that takes account of the context that's been described and the appetite of development banks, the need for security that was emphasized in the prior panel, the need for climate resilience that was mentioned by Minister Samud at the beginning of the day, the need for technology, the need for scale, the need for regionalism. What's one practical Monday morning initiative that takes account of the way that financing can be structured and the availability of financing that can move the needle for more ports in the direction of what you described as good? So that's the question. One practical initiative. And I'll start with you, Lilia.
So one practical initiative that I would suggest to the port authorities, but not only the port authorities because they cannot do it alone, is together with the government, is create the one maritime window. What I mean by this is port authority, customs, inspection agencies, and all other agencies that are there at the port are ensuring that goods are coming in and coming out efficiently, create one window and assess their performance as a group and not individually. This is what I would say. And by the way, digitalization is part of it, because without digitizing the whole process and continuing to move everything by paper is not going to bring efficiency. So create one maritime window. That's my suggestion.
So one digital maritime window is a Monday morning action. I can tell you as a port operator and shipping line and freight forwarder, freight consolidator, the amount of time that's spent doing duplicative processes to move boxes faster and the cost to do that, I can see the difference. Captain, Gus Anderson, what do you see as one big Monday morning initiative that can move the needle on the maritime sector in the Caribbean?
To follow up on what she was saying here is that to be able to safely dock the ship has to be the number one. That's a tip of the sword. If the channel is not wide enough, if the dock doesn't have the correct bollards, if it's not deep enough to take in the ships, that is the desired on the scale of what the port and what the community wants to have. That's going to have to be the number one priority, tip of the sword.
And for your perspective, is that obvious to Caribbean governments? Like from the perspective of a port operator myself, you know, we get up every morning thinking about the capital expenditure requirements. But, you know, would you say that's clear, or is that something that we need to get our minds around?
I think that we all need to get our minds around it, because just the scale, now I'm talking from the cruise operator, with these big ships, the enormity of having 7,000 guests, 2,500 crew members on board, not a secret, but a $2 billion asset, and to move that in, at the end, is going to be a controlled collision with a pier. And in order to make sure that that is done in a safe way at 100% level, we cannot be 99.9%. We need to be 100%, because we really don't want to make the PR people work by something happening that should not be happening. So that has to be. And I think that the enormity of having that big ship, that scale, could possibly be better understood in some areas.
So bringing this $2 billion asset in with 7,000 people aboard with very low tolerance for error, we need to concentrate on the capital that will allow that to happen consistently. Pedro, your one big move?
Yeah, well, being regional integration, one of our mandates, I would say regional integration. And for that, we have been working with ACS and CARICOM in developing the Caribbean integrations and logistic program that set out the gaps and opportunity for regional integration. So I would say regional integration.
Across ACS?
Across the ACS in the Caribbean, and how to find each country and each port its right role in the wider logistics and port ecosystem.
And regional integration for you is about trade? Is it about customs? What's the...
It's about everything, really. I mean, trade needs to be integrated, systems need to be interoperability, regulations, customs, in order to have a bankable project and a functioning infrastructure that serves the region as a whole. Because of the scale mainly, the region needs to have a better degree of integration.
Okay. Felipe?
Well, I would go to the concept that I called before, more, I don't know, holistic or strategic approach from the governments. Need to be improved different areas of the government that are involved in the maritime, what to call ecosystem. Going back as an example to the energy. If you think in a port in the Caribbean supplying shore power to the cruise industry, for example, then you need to think who is going to sell the power. The port probably do not have in their role sell power. Somebody need to define how that is going to be done. More than the fact that somebody need to think how the energy is going to be produced, but then a lot of different regulations between different areas of the governments need to be put in the same table to define the plan and to define the plan to start quickly with all those regulations. You can think in, I don't know, in a country that perhaps can have energy, but then the port currently can't sell energy to the ships because it's not in the rules of the port. Then going back to that more holistic view, I think is key.
Andrea, I'd like to give you the final word. You know, you painted this picture of what good could look like. We've listed the single window and digital transformation. We've said, let's ensure that we have the infrastructure that can handle big ships with certainty, with consistency. We've said, let's regionally integrate it and get regionalism working, and let's have it backed up by a holistic strategy of government. You persuaded? Something I'm missing? How do we close out?
I think it's the right way to look, but there's one tiny step in the beginning, and that is when you wake up at that Monday morning, look yourself in the mirror and say, do we know who we are, where we are, and what our roadmap is? And does that roadmap sync with regionalization, and whether it's whole of the Caribbean or sub-regions? That's the thing you have to ask yourself. Are we on the right track? Is this realistic? Is this too aspirational? And you have to ask yourself that every day. And of course, before you get into regional aspects, you must have your local stakeholders on board. So you all must be waking up on Monday morning at 7 a.m. and looking in the mirror and thinking the same thing.
I can't do it alone, essentially, is what you're saying.
Exactly. It's a team sport.
And we got to know where we're going. Thank you. I really appreciate the insights, the time, the focus. I'd like to, we have quite a bit of additional and very relevant developments on this very topic. So I'd like to hand back the microphone and the panel to the Atlantic Council. But, you know, I just want to say thank you for all that you've done and bring us to this place. Much appreciated.
Thank you to our panelists. Please remain seated for closing remarks from Governor Ron DeSantis. Thank you very much. welcome back to the stage Adrian Arch, Atlantic Council Executive Vice Chair and founder of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center.
Some longer remarks, all of which I'm going to skip because the important thing is to hear from the governor of Florida. I would only briefly say that I came from the state of Delaware when I moved down here, and Delaware is smaller than Miami-Dade County. So I had a great appreciation for Florida and its size, coming from practically the smallest state in the United States. Governor DeSantis has led Florida through a period of extraordinary economic growth, and under his leadership, Florida has continued to deepen its role as the commercial, logistical, and cultural bridge between the United States and the Caribbean. Everything we've discussed today, from the infrastructure, security, investment, and the workforce in ports, much of that conversation runs directly through this state, Florida. So, Governor, on behalf of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center and Caribbean Initiative, and all our partners gathered here today, we're grateful for your presence and your engagement with this forum. So please join me in welcoming the Governor of Florida, the Honorable Governor.
Great, good to see you all. Thank you. Please have a seat. It's great to be here. We, weather's nice. There's a lot of stuff. I know we have the Food and Wine Festival going on in Miami Beach. This is a very busy time of year to be in, particularly in South Florida. And the traffic validates that, because I landed, in the airport, and it took me almost an hour to go 9 miles. But here we are, and we're happy to be here. I'm thinking back as we looked at how kind of Florida's role in maritime, and particularly with our partners in the Caribbean, a lot of great countries that we have a huge impact with, from the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, all these others. We had an issue with during COVID where the CDC shut down the cruise lines. And, I was like, and I understood, particularly in those early days, people didn't know that you had a breakout on one of the ships, an outbreak on one of the ships, and so they were doing stuff. And, sometimes some people were just trying to be cautious. But then it got to the point, I'm like, well, wait a minute. You have an unelected bureaucracy that's going to just shut down an entire industry. That's not the way this country works. And so we actually sued the CDC, and we had a long, kind of fight with that. We sued, the cruise ships didn't even sue because they were scared of the federal government. They were scared, I think, of reprisal. So we sued on that, and we ended up winning that lawsuit, and really helped pave the way for the cruise lines to get back and going. It's an important part of our economy. Obviously, it's an important part of tourism. But, one of the things we did, I remember we did an event, I think we were at the Port of Miami, and I had all these workers there. And, a lot of them were having tough time because, part of it is, they needed income and all this. But a lot of it was like, this is part of their lives, their friends that they work with, all these other things. And it was like really, really a big deal to be able to get back to normal. So we're able to do that. And obviously, I think those cruise lines had much better productivity out of Florida than in some of the other areas that they've been able to do, and we recognize how important that is. We also have great synergy with a lot of the nations around this area. I mean, I remember when Hurricane Dorian came in 2019, that was actually, a lot of people thought it was going to hit Florida. So we did a lot of preparations. I mean, like that was my first year as governor, and so we had instituted some changes in terms of how we respond to storms. And one of the things is working with all the utilities to pre-stage these trucks so that when the storm passes, you can reconnect and get people up on their feet with the electricity and everything like that, gas, all the things, all the essentials. So we were doing all that, and we were preparing, and it's kind of coming towards the peninsula of Florida. But I also looked at all the storms that had ever come that way since 1851. They have them plotted, and I had my staff do that when I took office. And, you know, I looked, and most of them do turn, and then they ride the coast. And so Florida, they haven't had very many storms actually make a direct impact north of like Palm Beach. I think there was one, like 1964 or something, Dora hit Jacksonville, but they tend to do that. Now, I was not going to say that publicly. So the minute I say it's going to turn and it doesn't, oh, the governor said not to worry about it. But I'm thinking we're prepared. We don't know what's going to happen, you know, and so we're assuming it's going to hit, but I also think it's probably going to turn. And I was telling people that privately, my staff, and I was like, I'm not going to say it publicly, don't worry, but I do think, because I just saw it so many times happen in the curvature of Florida and all this stuff. So it ends up turning north, and so we had really no impact from Hurricane Dorian, and that got over 180 mile an hour sustained winds. It was a Category 5 storm, you know, but the Bahamas, you know, really, you know, Marsh Harbor all the way into Freeport, and it was going very slowly over the Bahamas, so really punishing, and then they did that. But, you know, there's a lot of Floridians that go there, they fish, they boat, they vacation, some of them have homes there, and so there was a lot of private support to be able to help folks in the Bahamas. And I mean, there was millions and millions and millions of dollars from Floridians that were put up towards that effort, you know, to help the victims of Hurricane Dorian. And I remember getting in I think the Coast Guard flew us around over that after the storm, and you're looking down, and I mean, man, it was some serious, serious damage, and I've been able to see how that's recovered over the years. Bahamian time is not quite as fast as we do it in Florida. They do it a little slower. We take pride in really being very, very fast with everything we're doing, but they have recovered, and I've seen some of those areas since then, and I'm glad that. But, you know, there was a lot of Floridians who were involved in that. So our state is a great state to be kind of this gateway, partially because we're doing the things that you need to do as a state. We're doing it right. You know, there was some news recently about New York City putting out their budget, and I think they put out a budget, and they have 8 million people, budget's $130 billion proposal. You know, Florida, we have 23.5 million people, and our budget's $117 billion. And so it's like, well, wait a minute, why are you spending all that? And then the state of New York, they have twice the budget, more than twice the budget than we have in Florida, yet, you know, we have better roads and infrastructure, services. You know, our public university systems ranked #1 in America, and we have the lowest tuition for in-state residents in the United States of America. So it's like some of these things are just choices. If you look at all the debt that the state of Florida accumulated over 180 years of our state's history, just since I've been governor, 7 years, we've retired half the debt of the state. And so we now have the lowest per capita debt of any state in the United States. And I think your share as a Florida resident would be about $400 per person. Your share of the federal debt as a U.S. citizen, I think, would be about $120,000. And so it's a much different situation, and ours is going down, theirs is going up. And I'd always tell people, there's the clock in New York City where they would always have the national debt adding, so going up. They've been doing it for decades. I was like, can someone please do a debt clock of Florida? Because it would actually be counting down, not counting up. Imagine that. Isn't that a great thing to be doing? So we've been able to do that. We have no state income tax, which is obviously something, you know, we're very fortunate to have. You know, it's now been making news. You've got people fleeing California for Florida, many people to South Florida, because there's a proposal in California to levy this 5% wealth tax. First of all, a wealth tax is bad policy because a lot of this stuff has already been taxed, and to the extent some of it hasn't been, it's basically an unrealized gain. So you going in and just taking 5% is not good policy, but you also have a provision that says whatever your voting rights are, they're going to impute that you own equity in that. Well, just imagine people that have founded companies, you know, maybe they own some, but their voting rights are a lot more. You're imputing massive amounts of money that they don't actually even own, but you're making them liable for the tax. So it's really an insane policy. It's caused a lot of people, you know, very significant people to flee because I think they're really worried about what's going to happen. Maybe this doesn't end up passing, but when you have these referenda that you can put on the ballot, it's just a matter of time before something passes. And we're here in the 250th anniversary of the United States' founding. The founders declared independence. They listed the reasons. They sketched out the underlying rationale and the source of rights and all these, the famous Declaration of Independence and the language in there, which is very important. But it took them another decade to come up with a framework of government, writing a U.S. Constitution and getting that ratified. And if you read the founders, one of the things they were concerned about is, they didn't want a monarchy, and they wanted government to rest on the consent of the people. But they didn't want your rights to just be decided by the bare majority of one popular vote in some referendum. They were very concerned about that. If 50% plus one can take property from others, then eventually this whole thing just goes asunder. And so I think part of the problem with California and why people leave is because they're concerned that if that's the way the government's operating, it's just a matter of time before they do a lot of dumb things. So you're now having people that are coming to Florida who've been very significant, and I think you've seen that very significantly in the last probably 2 months. New York, people would say, they elect this guy mayor, have you seen a flood of people? I don't know that we necessarily have. It's obviously early in the tenure, and so as that happens, you may see. But I will say there's a lot of meat that's been taken off the bone. A lot of people have moved down here over the last 7 years, and we've probably had one of the most significant periods of in-migration that any state has had in American history. In fact, if you look at the income that has moved into Florida since I've been governor, that is more income, even adjusted for inflation, than has ever moved into an American state in the entire history of the Republic. That's a pretty significant thing to have happen. And the number 2 state over this period of time to us is Texas, but I think we're 3 or 4x what has moved in to Texas over the last 7 years. So that's really, really significant. And the way I view it is I'm not asking people to move here because, some of my friends are like, man, we've got a lot of people that have come. Like, we don't need any more people. I'm agnostic about it. It's a free country. You can move where you want to move. You can do business where you want to do business. I'm not begging people at all to come. And honestly, having some moderation in that isn't the worst thing in the world from where we were a few years ago where so many people were flooding here. But be that as it may, it's a free country and people vote with their feet. And you see a very, very consistent trend of people leaving states that have high taxes, bad regulatory environment, bad approach to crime, too much homelessness, all these other things, moving to states, with Florida being the number 1, that take a different approach to all that. And that's likely to continue on some level for the foreseeable future. So all that being said, I think Florida is really a strong foundation from where you would want to have this gateway to the Caribbean. Obviously, we're really a gateway to the entire Western Hemisphere, particularly here in South Florida, and it's something that's going to continue to be an engine for years and years to come. I don't think there's been any state in the country that has been more supportive of investing in our seaports than we have here in the state of Florida. I mean, we've done really historic investment. Clearly, Miami, Port Everglades, we've got them up and down the coast, on both coasts, and it's been a real important part of our economy, both in terms of tourism, but also in terms of international trade. And I remember when they weren't able to get the ships in to Long Beach, we said, we'll take the ships into Florida. And we actually had some of the ships come for a time being, and we're very proud of that, and we're going to continue to do it. So I look forward to continuing these great relationships. I do some limited trade missions around the country, or around the world. We've done Japan, South Korea, Israel, United Kingdom, Ireland, Italy, and then we did the air show in France. We may be doing some stuff in the Western Hemisphere. Pretty easy to make some stops into the Caribbean. So we're going to work on maybe doing that and see if we can continue to bolster the relationship between the free state of Florida and our neighboring countries here that are close by. And everyone in this region has to deal. We didn't have any hurricanes this past year in 2025 I know that wasn't true for everyone. In fact, we were at Bermuda for the reinsurance conference, and they had gotten some. I think they're so used to it because they're kind of just out there. And I know we had another one that hit Jamaica. But Florida, we didn't have one after having 3 hurricanes in 2024. And we had a 10-year period where we didn't have any storms hit the state from 2006 until 2016. I'm hoping that this is another one of those periods where we have a good trend of tranquil summers. We'll see what happens. We did have that. We're always very prepared for that, and we're going to continue to do it. But clearly, when you live in this part of the world, I think us and the neighboring countries really understand what's going on. So the sky's the limit for what we can do. We're going to continue doing the right things. We're going to continue getting things done. And we look forward to working everyone that's involved, not just in tourism and maritime, but also international trade between the state of Florida and our neighboring countries. So God bless everybody. I hope you enjoy it down here in Miami Beach. There's a lot going on this weekend, so hopefully you guys can partake, but it's a great time to be in South Florida. Thanks, everybody. God bless.
Governor, thank you so much again, Governor DeSantis, for joining us. The governor's closing remarks showed why important it was to do this forum here in Florida, as the governor said, at the gateway to the Caribbean. I now have the pleasure of closing this summit by noting that today has been a quite remarkable day. We've heard from policymakers, port operators, investors, development finance institutions, maritime leaders. And what came through very clearly is the appetite for deeper cooperation, the opportunities on concrete, and the urgency is undeniable. We leave today with a mandate to translate this dialogue into action on port infrastructure, on investment frameworks, on workforce development, on security, and the use of technology to modernize and future-proof a maritime sector. This is just the beginning. The Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, our Caribbean initiative, will continue to build this momentum moving forward. I just want to close again by thanking our partners, Florida International University, Tropical Shipping, Port Miami, FGS Global, and Acero Capital. To our speakers, moderators, and everyone in this room, thank you for bringing your expertise. Thank you for bringing your commitment to this summit. And to my colleague, Maite Gonzalez-Latour, and the entire Atlantic Council team, thank you for your incredible organization. With that, safe travels, everyone. Enjoy Miami Beach, and we look forward to the next time.